Morning, everyone. I have greatly enjoyed the hospitality of the Bronfenbrenner Center and the new colleagues and old colleagues that I've interacted with here. My job is to be a commentator. I don't see my job as a discussant per se, right, where I'm to comment on each and every paper. I read all the papers. As I pointed out yesterday, I've learned a great deal from the conference and the papers. But I'm not going to pretend to be a family science scholar or a criminologist or a sociologist. I'm none of those things. But two things that I am will inform and influence what I'm going to share today in terms of a set of comments and observations. So here's my standpoint, so to speak, right? The first reason, which I think why I've been invited to come and say some things, is that I'm a patron and volunteer for a youth development organization in Atlanta. And that organization exists for the purpose of assisting children of incarcerated parents. The second reason why I've been invited is because I'm a political scientist. But the thing that makes me, I guess, matter is the fact that I'm focused on the ways in which formerly incarcerated people attempt to gain the full restoration of their political, civil, and social rights, which of course has consequences for how we think about parental incarceration and this idea that the formerly incarcerated should be good parents to their kids. And of course, one way to be or model being a good parent to your kid is actually be a good citizen, generally understood, with rights being important. So just regards to the first standpoint, so like many people, I live in a metropolitan area that has a central city that produces great numbers of people who go to prison. And of course, that also means, given the iron law, they return. Right? But when they return, we know they return to a certain set of neighborhoods. They don't just live, get to live everywhere. They return to, where they have residential connections, social capital, and a variety of other things. So here we have a map of the city of Atlanta. The NPUs mean that these are neighborhood planning units, which are compositions of neighborhoods. The reason why I present this is so that you can see that with regards to prison releases, where the greatest concentrations of returning folks are. And again, we know from the demographics that we're largely talking about returning parents to these communities. So the organization that I support and volunteer with is called Forever Family. It's been around since 1987. It used to be called Aid to Children of Imprisoned Mothers. It primarily does its work in NPUV. That's where its headquarters are located. That's where the bulk of its programming takes place. But you'll see that I have this circle that's dashed because the organization actually works with lots of kids and caregivers throughout the city of Atlanta, but also beyond the boundaries of the city of Atlanta, both throughout the state of Georgia, but elsewhere in the country. It seems to be doing some things right, at least from the perspective of some institutions that we actually have great support for, and who we know are invested in the sorts of issues that bring us all together. And so you're probably all familiar with the Annie Casey Foundation's recent report, A Shared Sentence, where the first recommendation that they have, recommendation 1, which is blurry up there, is the basic idea that the children of the incarcerated need to be protected, cared for, shown compassion, empathy, and all those things while their parents are away and when their parents return. And then the report goes on to highlight some organizations that it thinks they wouldn't necessarily call models, but are organizations that provide some promising practices, or at least doing the things that we generally think organizations should be doing. I think about the paper by Derek and Gordon and his colleagues yesterday, where they were really trying to help us understand, well, what are these programs actually doing? In the case of Forever Family, it's doing like the things we want to see. This first idea, and here I take it directly from our organization's website, where there's the idea that we're doing something for lots of different types of stakeholders. First thing for everyone, well, family visitation, which is the dominant programming that we provide for kids. Monthly visitation trips to 5 different prisons in the state of Georgia. Initially, it only started with the prisons that housed mothers, but now includes fathers as well. We have a focus on children in particular, of course, so after-school programming. But more and more, we're engaging more in the idea of teen and youth leadership development, which also includes opening their eyes and providing some incentives for them to go into entrepreneurship for themselves and to support their families. For the parents, well, basic parental education. Some of that is done within the prisons, but a lot of it's done once people return home to the community and a variety of other reentry assistance. And the other set of stakeholders who have come up in the last day, but the caregivers. We do a lot of work with the caregivers. And in particular, just simply trying to provide them with support, emotional support. And again, this idea of empathy, that one truly understands the challenges they're experiencing and the new sets of challenges that await them when parents return home, attempting to be full parents to their children again. But the other standpoint is, right, I'm a political scientist. And I think that what political scientists are learning about incarceration and its negative effects are also useful to at least introduce into our conversations that we have together. So here I have a slide that I've added a couple of things to that comes from my colleague Tracy Birch, who has this book called Trading Democracy for Justice, where she just wanted to simply help us understand, us being political scientists, understand how we could imagine that criminal justice contact could actually have some negative effects with regards to civic participation and political participation. So we have the basic idea of individual contact. I thought, well, if we're thinking about this individual contact, one, of course, it's the parents who are having this contact. But two, we know that there are childhoods and young adulthoods that are having this contact as well. And then this also allows us to begin to imagine that there might be intergenerational effects because of the parental incarceration. This contact produces a set of exclusions, which we know about, and which, Maddie reminded us yesterday to really sort of lift up and not forget, and how a lot of these exclusions are actually the production of public policy, which means they're the production of politics, right? From my perspective, we refer to it as distributive politics, because politics is about the distribution of good things and the distribution of bad things. And in the case of the groups that we're interested in, my goodness, don't we know how many bad things are distributed to them? And I'll say more about that in a couple of minutes. So we get these different sets of exclusions, which we imagine have some sort of consequences for basic things like people's attitudes towards government and public policy making. We also know that when people are incarcerated, at a minimum, that means that there's a reduction of role models from the community. But we also know that when people are incarcerated, other folks who are left behind have to pick up the civic slack, the democratic slack for those who are taken away. We see this in particular with regards to juries and jury selection. And the fact that even though, depending upon where you are, it might be difficult for African Americans to get on juries, in the case of thinking about black communities, who are the real jurors? Black women, right? Because men are away, and even when men come back, they can't be on juries. So some other things to imagine. Poverty, of course, has its variety of effects. But at a minimum, because of economic exclusion, people don't really have time to participate because they're hustling, trying to find the job. Or as was just pointed out, they have jobs, but the times in which they have to do their work to earn their wages, right, remove them from spaces and opportunities to simply be democratic citizens. So that means that they might not be able to show up at things that matter to their kids or have consequences for their kids, like school board meetings, parent-teacher conferences, all those sorts of things. We also know, too, that with regards to criminal justice contact, and in particular where we have concentrations of folks who have had incarceration, that there's actually less contact by political parties and other types of political and advocacy organizations towards those people and towards those communities. So political recruitment actually declines and is a negative effect of this initial thing we call parental incarceration, which then has consequences for individual political participation, but also has consequences for neighborhood participation, then creating this cycling and this interaction. What we know as political scientists, and we're learning more and more, and I'll be very honest, political science is very late to the game and the discussion of mass incarceration, and for the most part, we don't really pay attention to the parental aspect. However, we know that incarceration is actually consequential to the republic and the ways in which democracy plays out on a day-to-day basis in the United States. And if that's true, and given that we know that many of those who are incarcerated are parents, parental incarceration must really have, right, some consequences for us to possibly imagine. So here I just identify a couple of books that I rely upon greatly, particularly in one of the courses that I teach at Emory, where all of these books are the first two are books. The second one is an edited volume of the Annals Journal. Chris Wilderman was one of the editors of that. And I have a quote from the first book that I just think makes all the sense and sums everything up from a political science perspective, that there's a powerful effect of criminal justice contact on a range of political behavior and attitudes, which again is going to be consequential for how we think about the lives of the kids of the incarcerated. So what are we beginning to know as political scientists? Well, one, generally incarceration reduces civic trust, in particular, trust in government. And this also not only has consequences for the parent, but we also can identify some effects with regards to kids, or adults who were once kids of the incarcerated. Right? The other thing that we know is that it weakens democratic commitments, right, and civic commitments, to the idea that one should be participatory, for instance. And it definitely has a dampening effect with regards to voter registration and voting. At the same time, though, what we are finding are mixed effects with regards to other forms of political participation. So there are a variety of reasons why a formerly incarcerated parent might not vote. But those same explanations don't necessarily account and hold for other forms of participation. And there are lots of forms of participation. Again, like most Americans generally don't vote at all. So just keep that in mind. Now to move on to my comments. And again, my comments, I think, are informed by my two standpoints. Comment number one, the distance that scholars, and I add in here community partners, because a lot of the scholarship that's done is, yes, it's done by we academics, but I think some of the best scholarship is actually done through university community partnerships. So we and our community partners, the distance we've traveled in the study and science of parental incarceration, I think is quite upsetting. It should be very troubling, right? While we have had amazing presentations, and we've learned things, and we have lots to take away, at the same time, we should actually, we should be embarrassed. I did not want to use that word, but I'm going to use that word. I think the academy should be embarrassed that this is as far as we have in fact gotten. Why do I say that? I think about how in 2003 there was a book that was published. And in 2003, I wasn't paying attention to any of these issues. I was dealing with other stuff with regards to my research. But at the time, had begun working in Atlanta with the Urban Institute on its reentry mapping network. And I was one of the co-organizers of the Atlanta Reentry Mapping Network. And so suddenly I'm like, well, I got to kind of bone up on this stuff, get some sense of the variety of issues. And oh, hey, there's this great book called Prisoners Once Removed. In the book, there are these really nice chapters. The effects of parental incarceration on children, perspectives, promises, and policies. The adolescent children of incarcerated parents, a developmental perspective. Prisoners and their families, parenting issues during incarceration. So at a minimum, right, the academy has sort of actively and in multiple disciplines been thinking about the issues and challenges and consequences of parental incarceration, although as our colleagues pointed out, like Joyce and others, they had been at it like earlier than that. 13 years ago, this book came out. We now have papers for a new volume that's going to come out. And from my perspective, I'm not quite sure that much has really changed. Here I pull from one of the chapters in the book, this nice diagram, right? It's supposed to kind of sort of tie it all together. And it has all the things, the categories of concern that are being addressed in these papers and that have been presented to us over the last, almost 36 hours. We've got the pre-incarceration conditions, which really are speaking about, the place of the parent, in the context they find themselves in. Then you get the incarceration, and you've got these stressful life experiences, changes in family composition, on and on and on, right? Characteristics of the kids themselves, and all this is supposed to somehow inform and influence child adjustment, right? Which is like, I guess, the fancy way of saying the effects, right? What happens to the kid? Not only attitudinally, right, what are they thinking and what are their orientations towards their parents, towards the caregiver, towards their communities, towards their schools, even towards public policies and political institutions, but then also thinking about the actual behaviors of kids. And so I'm saying to myself, okay, I've read these 10 or so papers, and I'm reflecting upon what I see here from 13 years ago, and I'm like, okay, there are some things that were missing 13 years ago that we now can add to this, and just a couple of things from the papers and, again, the presentation. So here we've got Sarah and Robert's point about parental criminality, right? Both the observed, but as they were pointing out yesterday, the unobserved. Okay, we could put that in with regards to pre-incarceration conditions. Oh, incarceration of the parent. Oh, we have to remind ourselves that there are probably going to be not just single stints of incarceration, but there are going to be multiple stints of incarceration, right? Again, this idea of the churning of folks, connecting it to recidivism. Now, wait a minute. We also have to keep in mind the idea that the setting is going to matter, that we've got prison and we've got jail. We could add to the characteristics of the child, in addition to age, gender, temperament, IQ, and coping skills, resilience. We can also add in under the characteristics of the child other demographics, right? Where does the child live? Right? Anna and her colleague in their paper and presentation yesterday was reminding us of this idea in particular, like the geography and the geographic distribution of kids of the incarcerated and what that might mean. And then just as a final example, we can think too about, okay, under social support, friends and family, formal support networks, and then just add in this thing of programs, right? And the effectiveness of the programs. Although the challenge there is that, a lot of the effectiveness is just based on anecdata rather than empirical data. Comment number 2. Across multiple disciplines, the definitions and usage of parental incarceration, from my perspective, are incomplete. That in reading the papers, my general takeaway with regards to is, what is parental incarceration? Well, one, it's this thing up here, an indeterminate stage of confinement and control in a process of individual and mass removal and reentry, which is what all the papers are speaking to and describing, and that's their starting point. You read all the papers, and they all sort of go through, parental incarceration, this is the scale and scope of it, these are its dimensions, and then they get to what does the literature tell us in a given area, right? Developmental sciences, sociological, criminological, and all of that. Note that I put in here, a word that tends to really be missing is this idea of reintegration, right? Reentry is one thing, it just sort of happens, it's passive, doesn't really require anything from most of us, but reintegration is something very different, which means that communities have great power and influence over the degree to which parents coming home actually get reintegrated, although in the case of many of these parents, the word should be integrated because they're partly in the situations they're in because they were never adequately integrated into family, community, school, labor market, on and on and on. The second part of the definition I would take away, if I just relied upon the papers and the presentations, is that parental incarceration is, and here I'm using some of the words that have been used over the last 36 hours, a source of uncertainty, disruptions, ambiguous loss for parents, kids, and caregivers, right? Again, from my perspective, that's what I see to be the definition or sort of the consensus. But as a political scientist, I want to add some other things in thinking about this definition of parental incarceration. The first thing is that when I think about parental incarceration, we need to be thinking about policies and what they really are representing and doing. And so the first thing I would say is to add to parental incarceration, what is it? It's a bundle of punitive policies intended to inflict penal harm, especially degradation and loss of dignity, right? That's why parents have a hard time when they come out of prison, because we have degraded them by intent, and we have taken away their dignity by intent, which of course has consequences for kids, spillover effects, where even some of the kids themselves then experience a loss of dignity and a degree of degradation. That's why shame and stigma are so important. That's why we need to focus more on how shame and stigma actually operates in the lives of those kids, shaping and influencing their development, again, from my perspective, as citizens. The fourth thing, if I were making this a four-part definition or something like that parental incarceration is a source of individual, but also familial and communal imprisonment. And here I'm being very deliberate in using imprisonment and not using incarceration. The standard, long-standing way of thinking about the word incarceration, right? Yeah, you lock people up. And we start to confuse imprisonment. With imprisonment, we oftentimes think that it's the same thing as just, yeah, you lock someone up. But too much of that is a conversation or an emphasis on physical confinement somewhere. But the most classical understanding of imprisonment, and political theorists help us and remind us of this, is that all we're really talking about is bounded liberty and restricted mobility. And if we have that in mind, then we really begin to see again how policies really begin to bound the liberty of these parents while they're in prison, of course, but again, more importantly, when they get out of prison. And if we think about the idea of restricting one's mobility, my goodness, we restrict people's mobility, parents who have been in prison, we restrict their mobility in the housing market. We restrict their mobility with regards to educational opportunities. We restrict their mobility with regards to employment, on and on and on. And it's this broader sense of imprisonment that really creates many more of the problems and challenges. So again, right, yes, people go someplace, and we call it incarceration, but we have to remind ourselves of what are we really doing to those folks while they're there? Bounding their liberty, right, and restricting their mobility, sometimes for a short run, sometimes in the long run. Comment 3. Perhaps parental decarceration deserves as much, if not more, attention as parental incarceration. Right? Decarceration. We should be thinking about that as well, right? It's a coin. It has two sides. I mean, there's the incarceration part, and then there's the decarceration part. Why would we want to think about this? Well, one, like Sarah pointed out yesterday, oh my gosh, Sarah, I would really love to get a copy of your slides. Because that slide that you had that said, okay, you've got people in jail and prison, but wait a minute, this jail thing, if you really unpack it and think about how many people are cycling through, being detained, awaiting trial, it's like, that's pretty incredible. But at the same time, when you do that, there's still far more people on parole and probation, right, who we would call the decarcerated. And then you'll notice that I have the bracket going above and beyond the highest bar. And that's deliberate because I want to remind us that even once one is off paper, right, and allegedly free, there is a great sense of unfreedom that the parents with criminal convictions and stints of incarceration have in society. And so when we have this conversation about parental incarceration, if I'm pushing you to say, no, think about parental imprisonment, which is this broader thing, and really more institutional, not a residential confinement, well, my goodness, we actually are missing a lot of parents and kids from the conversation because we're only focusing on, oh, the parents who are still in the system somehow. But there are plenty of people who are no longer in the system who are still, in essence, under correctional control. From a political science perspective, we're still controlling them with regards to, in particular, their ability to exercise, or rather, one, restore their political rights and then exercise those political rights. Comment 4. Yesterday, and this was really inspired a bit by something that came up yesterday, but I felt the need to say it. We assume parents who are incarcerated and children during and enduring parental incarceration are full citizens with rights, rather than semi-citizens with graces from policymakers and others. Rights should be rights. But we know in the American context that's not really true, right? There are some people and populations that we have no qualms about taking their rights away and treating them as, you know what you get from us? You get grace. So it was brought up, the Children of Incarcerated Parents Bill of Rights. I don't think anyone would dispute that these should be the rights of the children of the incarcerated, right? Normatively, we can all back this. However, what we have in the United States, for some, is semi-citizenship. I couldn't get the, let's see, the quote I wanted spilled over 2 pages, so that's what's going on here. But in essence, there's one of my favorite political theorists, Elizabeth Cohen. She has this great book on semi-citizenship, where she focuses on people with criminal corrections records and on kids generally. And I just want to read this quote very quickly. This means that rather than dividing a population into citizens and non-citizens, we accept the fact that citizenship exists on a continuum. People do not hold one uniform public status. Rather, semi-citizenships abound, offering slightly differentiated bundles of rights to various subsets of the population. Full citizenship is defined as the possession of all fundamental social, civil, and political rights, along with legal nationality. Kids have legal nationality as citizenship. They lack all of these other things. But many people carry different versions of basic rights as a bundle. People may possess some, but not all of those fundamental rights. They may be missing an entire category of rights, and it goes on and on and on. And so we have the continuum, right? You're lacking the triumvirate of rights, or you have all of them. Well, why might this be? Again, political science has something to say about this. There's this basic framework called the social construction of target populations to try to explain why some groups in society get good things versus bad things. And I'll go through this super, super quick. You imagine that there are 2 dimensions. The first dimension we call social construction. You know, how do we generally perceive you as deserving or undeserving, moral or immoral? And then you overlap or intersect that with the degree of political resources that a group might actually have. And in the case of the folks we've been talking about, incarcerated and decarcerated parents, they fit into the category that one set of scholars would refer to as deviants, right? And so they basically get all the bad stuff. But then we have the children of the imprisoned. I put them in the middle because you know what? Depending upon the time, the place, the policymakers, the institutions, the kids are treated as dependents, meaning that they have a positive construction, but they still have a lot of political resources, but will still support them, or they're in fact treated as deviants, right? Where they have a negative construction, with that construction being informed and influenced by the stigma from the parent that transfers to the kid, as well as the stigma that comes from other people in the communities and families because that kid has a parent who is incarcerated or was incarcerated. So punitive policy designs create the just desserts for these deviants. So we have intentional justifiable harm to punish and regulate behavior, disproportionate use of sanctions, costs, and burdens for these folks, parents and kids, exclusions as the ones I identified, and a deviation from the principle of proportionality. We know we shouldn't be so hard, especially on the kids. But you know what? Their parents did wrong. So a few questions to consider, and then I will sit down. Should we commend the social sciences for getting us this far, or condemn the social sciences for not getting us farther in our understandings of the effects of parental imprisonment? How do we convert reviews of research, like the volume that's being produced, and all the new research that's currently being conducted and will flow from the production of what I think will still be an important volume, and the conversations that have taken place in this room, into what Charles Lindblom, the great political scientist, had called usable knowledge, to shape policies and rules of governmental but also non-governmental organizations that implement parental imprisonment as penal harm. Beyond publishing research, what is the obligation of academics to put research to work regarding policy? And then more importantly, from my perspective, political advocacy to challenge, undermine, and ultimately abolish parental imprisonment as penal harm. How may social science assist in strengthening and amplifying the political voices of and for imprisoned parents and their children, especially if we understand them to be semi-citizens? And then finally, why does imprisonment continue to endure as our first choice of collective action for parents convicted of crimes or awaiting trial and sentencing? So, thank you.